I'm Eve, and welcome to Endgame. We're all really excited to be here. And our special guest tonight is Dr. Brian Wynn, who's going to be talking about a really important topic, and that is health and its impact on our lives, both in terms of diet, exercise, nutrition, and maybe even get a little bit of a discussion going about VR and how it affects all of those areas. So welcome everybody, and it's going to be a great discussion.
Yay! Thanks,
Awesome. Thank
Eve.
you, Eve.
Anytime.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for
Welcome.
thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Ready to go?
So, yeah, thanks for coming on the show, Brian. We're excited to have you. You have a newly installed Oculus in your home that I came.
I
So
do.
just full disclosure, Brian's my supervisor. Yeah, at where we work at the rehab center and stuff. But you have a lot of experience in different areas of mental health and stuff. And yeah, so maybe if you could give us a little bit of background on your kind of experience and where you're approaching this from.
Absolutely. So I am a clinical psychologist by training, and in the field of clinical psychology, there are various different subspecialty areas. And the area that I chose, which was of particular interest to me, was health psychology. Some also refer to it as behavioral medicine. I really like the latter name better because behavioral medicine really implies that our physical health and medical issues that we might encounter are largely rooted in our behavior as human beings. So our behavior impacts our health in many, many ways. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? I can't think of many medical conditions for which there isn't, at least in some substantial part, a behavioral contribution to the development of that medical disorder and or the management of that medical disorder. So a couple of examples might be things like high blood pressure, for example, that might be impacted by my behavioral health in that if I don't exercise, if I don't eat healthy, and if I don't sleep well, I'm likely to develop problems with hypertension or high blood pressure. Same thing around weight management, management of blood sugar and diabetes issues and those types of things. So really the topic of behavioral health, generally speaking, is a passion of mine. As Psych made reference to, we happen to work in the addiction and co-occurring mental health disorders field, and Noah is in the process of getting a doctorate degree and working in that field. But really what we find is even in the addiction world, it's not all about addiction to substances or other types of addictions. It's really all about health and wellness. And behavioral health is a particularly important factor in that field as well. So the topic tonight, yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, can I just ask about the like professionally or academically, like behavioral health and psychological health, are the two synonymous, or what is the distinction between them?
Right. That is a great question. And Noah and I both subscribe to a model that looks at human beings as having three main domains, if you will. The way we think, the way we act, and the way we feel. And then there's some physiological concerns too, as Psych can share with you based on the model as he sees it. But really all of that, the thinking, the feeling, the acting is all tied up, and those are interdependent, kind of mutually dependent variables. So my behaviors can impact how I think, which then in turn can impact how I feel. How I feel might impact what I'm thinking, which then in turn might cascade into my developing a certain type of behavioral pattern. So really
Right,
they're
okay.
all intermingled together as human beings. And I agree with Noah's outset and his mentors view of all of this, that physiology is very closely involved in all of that as well. So our bodies are a big part of that. And back in the old days, we called it the mind-body connection, which nowadays is really not a thing because it's so commonly accepted by all of us that there is the mind-body connection. In fact, there are many, many more facets to it than that.
Okay.
So the behavior is but one component in what makes us human beings. There are three particular areas with regard to behavioral health that are impactful for all of us as human beings. That can be in a positive direction or in a negative direction. And those three areas I call the pillars of health because they're that critical for our health and wellness. And those areas, as Eve made reference to just a moment ago, are sleep, nutrition, and exercise. They're the areas in which we can most impact our health and wellness on a long-term basis. We can get healthy and then sustain wellness long-term by way of interventions in those three pillars of health. The one that oftentimes yields the most questions, and if I had to make a prediction tonight, I would say we will probably get, if there are questions, most questions would be aimed at the sleep field. It's always a hot topic for people when it comes to sleep. And those of us who are fascinated by technology might find that our sleep patterns are shifting. Am I right? In this day and age, some of that might be due to what we call, in kind of the pop culture terms, sleep hygiene issues. It's really about our behavioral sleep health and allowing enough time for sleep, or perhaps staying up a little bit late, indulging in some technological endeavors and that type of thing.
Just hypothetically, like VR or something.
Absolutely. The bright light exposure as well.
Right in front of our faces.
That's right. And we call it screen time. Screen time is really detrimental to our sleep, or it can be. So if I have an iPad or a smartphone in my face as I'm lying in bed at night and the TV is on behind this device, the photoreceptors in my eyes receive that light and send a signal to my brain saying it's time to wake up. And there's a wake pathway in the brain that gets activated. And this is why a lot of people describe this phenomenon of not being able to, quote unquote, turn their brain off at night. So they feel like they experience racing thoughts, and the things that we hear people do are remarkable. People are trying to find the elusive error in their checkbook and balance their budget and coming up with ideas for a screenplay, thinking of ways their mom wronged them, all kinds of different things at night in bed, other than winding down and relaxing their brain. And that was not aimed at you, by the way, Eve.
Why would it be aimed at Eve? What does Eve have to do with it?
I hear Eve outed herself earlier as a mother.
Oh, God.
So I noticed we have a question here already. Do you have a quick question, or is it a little longer? Because we...
Oh, is this the question circle?
It is, yes. Yeah.
I had no idea. I came here late. I actually have a question. I don't know if this has been talked about before, but there's like this weird thing that happens in VR. I don't know if the psychology department's actually aware of this, but like, for instance, I haven't seen one of my friends, one of my best friends, in like 3 years, like physically, but my head believes that we've been together last week because we were hanging out on the beach together in VR. Like, what is that? Like, I have this weird, it's starting to get this weird moment where like, it's like almost like two identities forming.
Yeah.
Well, that is something we've talked about quite a few times on Endgame, right? Like the social the social component of VR is
attachment.
Yeah, like this is a social interface as much as physical space is a social interface. So it's definitely something that's has a psychological component. So I really like that question. Before we get too distracted, though, I kind of want to stay on topic just a little
Sorry,
bit.
I had no idea this was a question circle.
Yeah,
I just got
no,
here
it's
for the
okay.
first
And
time,
also-
and
Fine.
I
just
had
so
no
you
idea
know-
what was going on. I'll just
Yeah,
move
we're
on over
talking.
here.
No, it's
You're a
okay.
cool
And
avatar,
we're
by the
talking.
way.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, and our focus is kind of on the sleep, nutrition, exercise, health kind of thing, and yeah, so that's kind of the
Okay,
focus
cool.
for tonight. It's
I'm
like a
new to
talk
all
show where
this.
we
I'm
have different.
sorry.
You're
No, it's good.
welcome. We're
It's
glad
good.
you're here.
Welcome. Yeah.
You're welcome.
So catapult, did you have a question too?
Yeah, on the sleep thing, I'm a retired railroader. For the last 30 years that I worked graveyard shift. And the railway sent us documentation, it gave us documentation. It's called circadian rhythms. It's basically how your body clock gets used to shift work and stuff like that. And I think the best thing that I did as compared to some of the other guys is when I was on days off, I'd stay on my night schedule. So I'd stay up all night and just, go to bed at usual time and whatnot. The only problem being a night person is that you're trying to sleep when the rest of the world is doing their thing. So trying to sleep when the next door neighbor is hammering on his house because he's doing renovations or lawnmowers are going in the summer and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
It is. It is. I used to wear earplugs and all sorts of other stuff. I used to have a fan when I didn't want to have a fan because the fan drowned out other noises from outside and so on and so forth. But the only time I would change my schedule is when I would go on holidays. Like if I go on 3 weeks holidays or something like that, then I'd get myself on some semi-day kind of thing. So that way, if I wanted to go to the mountains or go do stuff. But otherwise, I stayed on my shift.
So what can you tell us about is it circadian rhythm or circadian rhythm? I've heard both.
The circadian rhythm disorders, and you're exactly right, Catapult. The most common circadian rhythm disorder is shift work disorder. At last estimate that I read, over 40 million Americans are shift workers. Shift work is defined as anything outside of the traditional business hours. So even second shift work can impact our circadian rhythms. So each of us has a master clock in our brain. It's housed in a part of the brain. I always like to say it because it's got a really cool name. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And in the suprachiasmatic nucleus is our master clock. And our master clock essentially tells us when to be awake and when to be asleep. Human beings, all of us as human beings, are built to be awake during the day, during the light hours, and asleep at night when it's dark. In fact, there are very specific things that happen in our body as the sun starts to go down and as it gets dark outside. Our core body temperature changes. Certain things happen in the way of other things related to our core body temperature, and there's a gland in the brain called the pineal gland that releases something called melatonin into our bloodstream. That's a real thing. It's a hormone. You can also buy it at the drugstore in a bottle, but it's a hormone that's released into our bloodstream, and it's nature's way of telling us it's time to go to sleep. So that all happens as it gets dark outside. And again, those photoreceptors in our eyes take those light and dark cues and tell our body it's time to go to sleep. Likewise, when the sun comes up in the morning and it gets light outside, even through our eyelids, we get signals sent through the photoreceptors back to the part of our brain that stop the release of that hormone that puts us to sleep and actually activates the wake pathway in our brain and tells us it's time to wake up. So when Catapult spent all of these years doing shift work, he was essentially going against the grain of what he is supposed to do from a neurological standpoint as a human being. Now, he was doing the right thing from society's standpoint because he was earning a living, and it sounds like he had a long, illustrious career with the railroad and provided for his family, no doubt, and this, that, and the other. And a lot of folks end up getting what they call a shift differential pay because shift work is so hard and so impactful on our lives, both socially and in terms of our family home life and in terms of health. It's a health risk to work shifts like this, to do overnight shift work for many, many years. And Catapult, I'm not asking you to expose your medical history here, but it causes increased risks for blood pressure problems, heart disease, weight gain, mood symptoms, memory problems. There is a 55% increased divorce rate in shift workers, believe it or not, compared to the average population. Isn't that interesting? And what you described, Catapult, the phenomenon of coming home, trying to close your eyes and go to sleep just as the sun is coming up and everyone else is getting up and getting going, people don't respect the fact that you're trying to sleep during the day, I'm guessing, right? Your phone starts ringing. Perhaps you have family obligations and you think, well, I need to tend to them now while I have time, and then I'll sleep later. And unfortunately, sometimes later never comes with regard to you catching up on your sleep. So it really results in kind of a chronic sleep deprivation that puts us at health risks over time. And whatever the shift differential pay is for a lot of people, some folks over time think, boy, it's not worth it for me. It's impacting my health and wellness in such a dramatic way that I need to rejoin the rest of the world and start sleeping at night and being awake during the day again.
Yeah, because
did you have a? Oh, sorry, I saw a quick comment over here. Did you have one?
Yeah, I had a question.
Sure.
Okay.
Is this related to to Catapults?
Well, there are two things. One is that I talked to Zarny Whoop before and he's here, and I talked to him.
Next to you.
Yeah, before the meeting, and he had some really interesting things to say. And Zarny Whoop, I hope you don't mind that I'm asking you to share those about living in Sweden and having, 2 hours of sunlight and in certain seasons, and if maybe you could
specifically.
and maybe he could talk about that, because I found it really, really interesting. If you wouldn't mind.
So as far as pacing goes, if we want a bit of a longer talk about that, like maybe we could get you in the line if that's something you want to do. I noticed we've got a few people here to get through. But
yeah, and Catapult,
I just had one.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Sorry, I just had one question. I don't know if this is the right time to ask the question, but
Sure.
there is a cycle of physical vigor and mental health, and it's sort of iterative and it feeds on itself. So if someone exercises and eats well and sleeps, and they're probably going to have good emotional health. But the reverse is true, and when someone's depressed, they don't feel energetic. They might have trouble sleeping. It's just the opposite, and it can spiral downwards. And my question is how to break into a downward cycle, and how you accomplish that, because one is almost a product of the other.
Absolutely. That is a great question. And you're absolutely right. There's a cyclical effect to that. And just as thinking, feeling, acting have these bidirectional relationships between these three components, so do the three pillars of health. They also have bidirectional relationships between all three of those factors. Sleep is often a great entry point for breaking those types of cycles, because whether we realize it or not, there are some very real, specific, commonsensical sleep hygiene recommendations that can go a long way in terms of improving our sleep health, which then in turns improves our physical well-being and our mental well-being as well, Eve. So I happen to be board certified in sleep disorders medicine and spent many years seeing tons of patients with insomnia, literally dozens of new patients per month. It's a very common problem. And intervening at the sleep level, we saw so many times, was so helpful in improving one's mood, memory, cognitive functioning generally, their physical health. When we sleep better, the metabolism goes up. So they find suddenly that they're starting to lose some pounds, which then impacts their physical health. Their blood pressure might settle a bit. So there's so many impacts that sleep can have in those other areas. And it's kind of the equivalent of a Gordian knot. It's all intertwined in such an intricate and fascinating way that intervening anywhere in that cycle can really have a positive impact. The hard part is when someone is not sleeping well, they're tired, they have insomnia, they're depressed, it certainly changes the game a bit, because they might not have the wherewithal to engage in a proactive plan of behavioral health to improve their wellness overall. That's the part. The motivation factor is really, really tough. So a lot of times, I hate to say it this way, but there's a bit of a sales pitch to it. It takes some convincing to be able to get someone to engage in the type of behavioral health that they really need to feel better. And that's really the art form to it in a lot of ways, is to find ways to convince someone to dig deep and get that motivation.
And
Say?
Yeah.
That sounded like you had something to say.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, also I'm getting some audio lag as well, so I don't know if there's it's kind of distorted.
Yes,
I
don't know. I thought
I'm just
someone
ignoring
came
it.
in with an avatar. But Catapult, did you have something else?
It's just like I say, after doing nights for so long, like during nights, I didn't have a social life. So basically, my computer was basically my best friend. I would do IRC at the time and stuff like that, internet relay chat, and that's how I socialized. I mean, everything was closed. So when I was on days off, everything was closed. And
it's
so
cool that you
it's
have
not
that resource for social activity. That's great.
Yeah, well, that's what I used basically, because I didn't have a choice. If I would have had this back then, this would have been fantastic. But
it's very adaptive.
That's what I was also going to say too, is the virtual reality is like a way that you can fall into almost accidentally activating the exercise component, the exercise pillar of those 3 pillars, where as what Eve was talking about, getting out of the spiral, it seems like people, when they're using VR and they're having social interaction and they're standing in their room and having, they're active and things like that, that it's facilitating some of that.
Who here plays Beat Saber?
Yes.
Anybody? Yes. All right, cool. Let's see, what are some other good ones? Gorn is another really physical one. That's kind of a violent one. Let's see, what's another good
Audio Shield?
Audio Shield, Quiver, even, I mean, some of these other ones as well that I've found that are fairly new. And
what's that racing game where you
for VR?
Sprint Vector.
Yeah, Sprint Vector.
There's also the lab.
For VR.
Yeah. So Catapult, I admire you that you did 3 decades worth of coping with a circadian rhythm disorder like shift work, and you found some healthy and adaptive ways to stay connected with people and maintain a sense of interpersonal connectivity. That's the kind of adaptive behavioral health that most people don't really have the wherewithal to really proactively pursue. So good for you. And I would imagine that it did you a whole lot of good in terms of your ability to cope with doing the shift work for so many years.
But like you said, the thing too is I am on blood pressure meds. I've been retired for 4 years now, so I've been a day person back as a day person for 4 years, which took me a long time to get used to. But I'm on blood pressure meds, and I would say by the end I wasn't feeling good. I was happy as hell to get out of there. And
30 years is a long time.
But anyway,
thank you for sharing.
It's just giving somebody the outlook of a night person, what they go through and all that. So when you see these people working at all night restaurants and all that, and they're dragging their ass around and they're all tired as hell, you know why? Because what happens,
That's right.
you try and sleep, the little bit of sleep you get, Then you get up, you do your thing, you go do your shopping, you run your errands. Then you go to work, you're already tired. By the end of the shift, you're a total bag of you know what.
Yes, and this is how accidents happen. People don't realize there's a dramatically increased risk for accidents, motor vehicle accidents, railroad accidents, cruise
Agreed.
ship accidents, oil tanker accidents. We've heard about these. How about air traffic controllers who are doing shift work and
That's
expected to
scary.
be alert and awake and manage air traffic? But by the way, other circadian rhythm disorders are things like, you may have heard of jet lag. I bet Zarni Whoop is familiar with jet lag. He also is in an area where there's not much light certain times of the year, I would imagine, and then maybe other times of the year there's more light than dark. So those all cause circadian rhythms. There's also something called delayed sleep phase syndrome. This is the night owl phenomenon. I would bet there are a few people in here, if I asked for a show of hands, who have experienced the night owl phenomenon. I certainly have it. And then there is also the opposite end of the spectrum, the early bird phenomenon, which is advanced sleep phase syndrome. This would be something that you see a lot of the times in retirement homes and things like that. So my father is an older adult, and he oftentimes is asleep by 7:30 or 8 p.m. and awake at 3 a.m. with breakfast at 4 a.m., lunch by 10 a.m., and he's ready for dinner mid-afternoon. And it's just everything is kind of moved in a direction that is advanced, and that's where we migrate to as we get into our older adult years. So these are all circadian rhythm disorders, and a circadian rhythm disorder really is any misalignment of our sleep pattern with what it should be, and that's probably the best way I can think to describe it. And what it should be, again, as human beings, would be going to sleep when it's dark at night and being awake and alert during the day without fail. Lyko, you have a question?
Hey, just a quick note.
Sure.
Before we move on, there's some weird audio lag going in. Please remember, if you are wearing a really complicated avatar that uses a lot of draw calls, please change to a simpler avatar that is not as hard on our CPUs.
Yeah, I'm going to block avatar. If you go to settings, also in block avatar by default, that completely eliminated my audio issues as well. So that'll just turn people who you're not friends with into default avatars, but it really helps with the lag. It's in the upper left of the.
I'm actually getting rid of that yellow.
The yellow thing.
Getting rid of that action point.
Okay, so Lyko, go ahead.
Okay, anyway. What are you going to do with the 40 million Americans in the poverty line to get the nutritional needs which is to sleep, eat, and what's the third one?
Exercise.
Yeah, sleep. Yeah. Because the problem is that there's a lot of unhealthy foods that are cheaper than the healthy options.
Yes.
And they also, and the fact is that they don't get a good sleeping time because of the fact that they have to work to get the money they need. I mean, they have to work a lot to get the money they need. And then they don't have time to exercise because most of the time they're working. Sure, you could say that work is partially exercise. But what are you going to do with the poor people people under poverty or something?
Yeah,
that's a really good
factors
question.
play into that.
Great question, and that is a fantastic question. I happen to be in the United States, as you may have gathered. We have in the United States a different set of issues than in other countries in many different ways. So in the United States, we might be the capital, if you will, of what I would call junk food. And quite frankly, you're exactly right, Lyko. It is quicker and easier and cheaper to eat junk, is it not? It's why they call it fast food in our culture. You can literally drive through and get a giant bag of food that is awful for you, by the way, for a very cheap price. So you're right. Culturally, That's right, and a milkshake to top it off.
Yeah.
So in our world, culturally, healthy nutrition is not encouraged. And by the way, as a result of that, we have an alarming obesity rate. The obesity rate, particularly for children, is aiming at the 40-something percentile in the next decade
there's a lot
or
of
so.
obese poor people.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So
And the
it
food
costs
deserts as well.
more. That's right. It costs more to eat healthy. It's also more time consuming. Typically, fresher things have a tendency to go bad sooner. So people end up going to the market multiple times per week, and they pay more money to buy more food that they may or may not want to take the time to prepare into a more nutritiously balanced meal. So you're absolutely right. Those are behavioral health issues. The other thing is in countries in which there are more folks that fall below the poverty line, in which socioeconomic status is lower, you typically don't see a lot of problems with insomnia. It's very much an industrialized nation problem. So in the United States, again, for example, we have made more and more and more increased movement toward a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week society year-round, correct? So now, as we continue to move more in that direction, and we have people like Catapult who work around the clock, so we've got first shift, second shift, third shift. People are constantly on their digital devices. These are high-class problems, if you will, in industrialized nations. And Japan is the worst, by the way. They have an average nightly total sleep time of less than 5 hours.
Yeah,
that is
There's
awful
also a lot of technology
in terms of health. That's right.
They're huge insomniacs.
Yeah.
That's right. And now, when it comes to the movement part, the exercise part, the American College of Sports Medicine recommends a minimum of 20 minutes of vigorous movement of some type, minimum 5 times per week. So if someone is actually working really hard for a living, they are probably getting the type of movement, calorie burning, and though it's not dubbed exercise because they're working, the type of physical activity that they would need to sustain their metabolism, to burn calories and those types of things. It doesn't involve necessarily going to a fancy gym or those types of things. In fact, we have some software applications that we have worked on that actually prompt people to get up and move if they've been sedentary for more than an hour. But again, in the United States, I'll say it openly with anyone listening, we're a very sedentary culture. There are a lot of folks that don't get the type of movement they need on a day-to-day basis. On top of that, we don't allot enough time for sleep. And then that is compounded by the third factor of the drive-through fast food phenomenon, the big bag of food I described. So it is a recipe for disaster, pardon the pun. Eating junk, not sleeping well, and having a very sedentary lifestyle. So if that is true and that hypothesis holds, then the antidote to that would be good sleep hygiene, healthier nutrition to the best of our abilities, understood that some people may or may not have the financial resources to be top-notch in terms of finances, nutrition, but doing the best they can to be mindful around what they eat, and an activity level that is sufficient enough to keep their metabolism up and burn calories.
Yeah, and it's interesting because even the virtual reality is also a privileged technology that can help people.
But this kind of ties into something that, like, we've talked about a little bit, like a couple times, which is that, like, in order to be healthy, you have to compromise against the expectations that your social world is imposing on you. So, like, with Catapult, like, his social world involved him working nights, and so for better or worse, he had to compromise his sleep schedule in order to meet that expectation. And, like, so that's kind of unfortunate when your personal health has to be at odds with what society imposes on you. And, like, navigating that is difficult, I think, for probably everyone, and then to varying degrees depending on your situation. So like that, I mean, that's so tough though, especially the food thing. Like, absolutely. I don't know, I mean, people with a lot of kids that are not in a good economic situation, like what can they do except just, you know, get the food that's
Right.
available, sort of thing.
Absolutely.
But like
It's
what
true.
you were saying, Poplipo, what you just said, a key thing is um, that thing about what society expects of you. You don't know how many times I was frustrated as hell when I couldn't sleep because the guy next door was hammering on his house or whatever. But yet in the middle of the night, if I made a peep, somebody would take a fit.
Yeah.
I said, so it's okay for you to make all the noise you want, but yet I drop something on the floor and you're taking a fit.
Right.
Yeah.
So then there's the emotional factors of trying to negotiate with the people that you're interacting with, and that's miserable too.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it's people aren't sensitive to that type of thing. You know, the cultural norms are we're asleep at night, awake during the day. If you are violating that catapult, you know, people just don't seem to be sensitive to that. They look at it as that, and that's one of the challenges, I think, from a cultural standpoint about that. Yeah, question?
Is my mic working?
Thank you,
Joe,
Michael.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yo.
We can hear
Okay,
you.
so this is an actual like I have a question. Is this talk about just like sleep in general or like sleep deprivation? Like is this
All
like
of the
health
above.
in general.
all of sleep in general? Okay, so like
Oh,
one thing I have
yeah.
it's with lucid dreaming, all right? And it happens very rare with me, but then why is it whenever I realize I'm dreaming, I become someone within the dream that I scare myself? Like I will do things, anything, because it's like I almost know I can get away with it. So like the most horrible
episode that we did.
Yeah, we had an
funny.
Endgame episode about lucid dreaming as well. So
Yeah.
so
It's
you're right,
interesting.
Really good questions.
Yeah. Well, and it's a great question. Lucid dreaming is kind of a puzzling phenomenon to a lot of people. There's no real scientific evidence to support the root cause of it. Who might experience lucid dreaming at what phase in their developmental span it might be prone to being a phenomenon for them. Can we control it? There are hypotheses out there around the fact that we can script our dreams. And in fact, there's something called image rehearsal therapy, believe it or not, and you can search that and find that it is a psychotherapeutic intervention whereby folks who have nightmare disorder or recurrent disturbing themes to their dream can actually get into a therapeutic intervention called image rehearsal therapy, whereby they can re-script their dreams and really rewrite your own story.
Yeah, my old mentor
And I know that
did
sounds puzzling, but yeah, it's a really interesting thing, and I've actually done it several times with great outcomes. A lot of people who have a history of trauma or exposure to traumatic events, or the new buzz term these days, adverse childhood experiences. Let's face it, there are not many of us that come from a perfect family of origin. I'm not sure that exists in this world, but nonetheless, adverse childhood experiences are reflective of perhaps what some might call dysfunctional family issues that all of us generally to some degree or another on a spectrum have arisen from. So with adverse childhood experiences, trauma exposure, those types of things, people are much more prone to have the types of themes I think that you're describing. That's not to say that that's on your diagnosis list. It's just something that we see in terms of a correlation between those things.
So,
I do have a question towards that. Like,
sure.
Should I be concerned if the most vile humanity has to offer can happen in my lucid dreams? Is that like a concern? Or
Here's what
is
I would
that
say.
dreams though? Like that can happen in any dream,
Yeah.
lucid or not.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. I would only say it would be a concern. That's a great response. I would only say it would be a concern if it is disturbing and fragmenting your sleep to such a degree that it's impairing your functioning. So you wake up and you're exhausted, or you can't sleep, or you're afraid to go to sleep. Bedtime becomes dreadful, or your bedroom becomes a battleground and you develop insomnia, and those types of things. So if there's some type of impairment in functioning that comes from this, a consequence of it, then I would say it would be more of a concern. Otherwise, you're absolutely right. It is a dream over which we have a limited amount of control.
So,
okay.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And yeah, thank you for these questions about dreaming, because I think it's really inherently tied to sleep. I'm curious too. So on Endgame in general, we kind of talk about like future as well, like looking into the future and things like that. So I'm curious, like where you think, I don't know. I mean, and maybe Popo, you also have a good way to frame this, but like, I guess what technologies how do you see in the next like 50 years or something like that? How do you see the way that we interact with food or nutrition or exercise or sleep and exercise? How do you see that changing or evolving over time? And just one,
where
like,
can
kind
technology help us with those things?
One example I just want to throw out too is that I drink Soylent, which is like this drink that, it's like, it's like a GMO drink that's grown and created or whatever, and has, all the nutritional elements you need, and it's pretty cheap and things. So I don't know, is that part of this whole future of technology? Like, where do you see everything kind of going?
Absolutely. So I want to say first and foremost that I'm grateful to Psych publicly. I want to acknowledge that he has brought me into the metaverse and introduced me to virtual reality. I'm new to this, very new to this. And here's why I say that. I think front and center, first and foremost, the most critical thing that I see in the future, and I really see it rooted in VR, is the interpersonal connectivity. I can tell you that I feel connected to you guys here right now.
Well, you're right here in front of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And Psych and I we actually have big plans, and Psych, many of you may not know, has outstanding, incredible ideas about virtual reality being used in multiple different behavioral healthcare worlds. But the interpersonal connectivity to me that I get in my limited experience in VR has been incredible. I would submit to you that it is as meaningful in the VR world for me so far as it is in the real world. And that's just been my experience so far. I love it. And so human connection to me goes a long way in terms of my mental and emotional well-being. Well, now going back to that pyramid model where you have how we think, how we feel, and how we behave, if I am in a better place mentally and emotionally because I have an interpersonal connectivity with people that's more accessible in the VR world, that is then going to impact my behavior and how I feel, and really start a cycle of good things happening in my life. So despite what some critics might say about VR out there and people disengaging from the real world, I think really leaning into engagement in the virtual world could have huge health and wellness benefits for us in the future. Now, there's the no-brainers too, related to the movement piece. We noted several different games, and I know there will be many, many more that actually involve a lot of movement. I'm moving right now, even though I'm sitting down. I'm a sedentary American right now, but I'm still moving, and I feel engaged with you. And it's not actually just sitting sedentary. It all involves movement and activity to me. And so people don't need to train for the Olympics to meet their movement goals, but instead they just need to remain actively engaged in life. The nutrition piece, Noah, that you mentioned, that's a tougher one. With the emergence of all of these gargantuan organic food companies and others, and now the bigger corporations seem to be kind of scooping them up and gobbling them up, and pretty soon somebody will be able to drop quinoa on your front porch by way of a drone, I believe, and those kind of things.
Yeah.
The accessibility to healthier options for nutrition, I think, will get better, no question. And I believe there will also be very clever people who end up developing different types of foods that give us better options that might be more affordable and accessible, as someone made a great point earlier, for the lower socioeconomic status type group as well. Sleep is a whole different thing. I think sleep, it's yet to be determined what the impact of, for example, virtual reality might be on our sleep. I'm not sure there's been a lot of research done yet on exactly the type of light exposure that we have as part of wearing a VR mask and what that might do in terms of our circadian rhythms.
But we can
I
actually,
am certain
we can actually do a little research right now. Not that this is it's a biased sample, but yeah, I'm curious to do a poll, like using the emojis. I'll count down from 3 once I ask the question, and we can like vote. You guys can vote on whether or not this is the case. So for me, I feel like virtual reality, I have to like get out of virtual reality for a little bit before I go to sleep, and that I noticed that like the bright screen makes it more difficult for me to go to sleep. Like I'm kind of stimulated. So I guess on the count of 3, thumbs up if you find that virtual reality makes it harder for you to fall asleep than compared to if you weren't using virtual reality, or if
they
Mm.
didn't wait to the count of 3.
It's okay. Yeah. So
There's
thumbs
a
up
lot
if it
of
makes it
thumbs
harder.
up,
Yeah.
So most
Yeah.
people, okay, we're getting a few different types, but I know that some people, especially in the
Interesting.
earlier days, I don't know if it's as much of a thing now, but like some people will sleep in VR, and there's like rooms specifically
Sure.
designed for people to go
Has
and
anyone
sleep
done
in
that?
VR
Has
and
anyone
have slumber parties.
I
Wow.
I've tried it, but
I've
Interesting.
drunkenly fall asleep.
Horrible.
oh, that counts. I guess I've done that too.
My eyes were so
This
dry.
big red ring around your face.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
It's not very
that's right.
comfortable.
It's not. The headset's really, but when the headset gets more comfortable and everything, well, who knows?
What's in our heads,
because then
yeah.
Right,
Maybe
right.
some people
Yeah.
need comfort, so they need to sleep on VR chat.
Like social
great
comfort. Yeah,
point.
that's a really good point. Yeah, like
Yeah.
this psychological. You're more comfortable socially, so you feel you can
Absolutely.
kind of just let yourself go a little
What I
bit.
do
and
like
sleep.
is that I can have slumber parties again. I haven't had those since I was a kid, and now now they're
Yeah.
a thing again.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
true.
and I like in
There
the
were actually some parties in
predisposition
VR
toward,
chat before.
you've had slumber parties, Arnie Whoop? Is
I
that who said
personally
that?
haven't been in one, but I know like it was like in 2017 there was like a whole week where there like this dedicated group of people that just they had a slumber party like every day or for a week.
Right.
I wonder what their
Wow.
sleep quality was like.
Interesting. Yeah. And
Sorry,
there's,
what were you saying?
I was saying there's a predisposition toward having certain problems with sleep too. So it might be that psych can do VR for 3 hours every evening right before bedtime and go right to sleep, and I might do it for 30 minutes occasionally before bedtime, and it keeps me up for the night. So there are certain folks that are more predisposed to having trouble with sleep than others, and I often liken it to nutrition in a lot of ways. Have you ever met a person who could eat a half a dozen donuts on a daily basis and they never seem to gain a pound?
So frustrating.
I know.
And then there are some people who might eat 1 donut once a month and they gain 2 pounds from that. There are just different predispositions from a genetic standpoint and from on a cellular level in a lot of ways that predispose us to problems in the behavioral healthcare world, I think, like sleep and nutrition both.
That's another thing that technology could help us with. I really like the idea of, getting it more integrated with our bodies. Like you can get so much information about your body now from like your phone. Like your phone can take your pulse, and like there's all these different, it can do all these different things, and like maybe that gets connected to our VR headset. And so when I'm in VR, I can see like where my blood sugar is and my blood pressure and my pulse and everything. So I know what's happening. I'm getting like feedback about my own health, because I feel like that's a huge like if we could get something like that, we'd have a if I could engage in activity and then know immediately the effect that it's having on me, I would be able to tailor my activities better.
And the knowledge that the activity is having an effect can create an effect in and of itself, which is the placebo, you know. So like you could just think that it's having an effect, and then it leads to so it's a good feedback. But yeah, the body worn sensors are going to increase, I think, our awareness and ability to you know, direct. And also, I mean, it's interesting because actually Apple just announced with their next iOS update, I'm sure a lot of people saw this, is that it's keeping track of how long you're in each app, and it shows you on a dashboard so that you can be more informed. So that's a good example. Yeah, it's a good example of like, and I'm sure that could happen here where you have a Fitbit and you're using VR, and it's like you see, you know, you could link that data and say, oh, when I'm using VR, it's harder for me to fall asleep, and or you know, and things like that. And like, Lyco, did you want to? I know you had a quick thing before.
Yeah, I was gonna say if someone actually slept in VR chat.
Yeah, they have. Yeah, lots of people have.
Yeah, like you just basically set the low brightness and then you just sleep. Lol.
Yeah. So
some people are more tolerant of it than others. I've tried it a few times, but the headset's too heavy, and so I can't do it.
I sleep on my stomach, so it would be really painful to try to sleep in VR.
It would be
you just can't do it. I don't think.
Tough.
But yeah.
Pablo, I'd be scared of that idea you had there with the phone that monitors your things and lets you know, hey, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this right, and all that. The thing would probably tell me, how come you're not dead yet?
Other questions about sleep, nutrition, exercise, wellness in general? Any comments or thoughts and feedback?
On nutrition. Yes. Actually, what do you think is better, like as far as veganism or people who eat both vegetables, meats, and fruits?
So for me personally, and I think first and foremost, it's a matter of choice. I do not subscribe to veganism. I actually am a strong advocate for a variant of the Mediterranean diet, and it's heavy in things like, for example, omega-3 fatty acids. So it helps to heal our brain and bodies, and we do essentially damage to our brains and bodies on a daily basis. That starts the moment we're born, essentially. I think that's part of the human condition, but different nutritional benefits that happen to come from variants of what has been known fairly commonly out there in the world as the Mediterranean diet is one of my favorite diets. So personally, I like meat. I don't know. I'm not sure how else to put it.
I know the problem with veganism is like you might not get enough protein. But like there are ways to do it. You just have to be really careful, and that's another one of those things that you might have to like. That is a balance, right? Like if your ethical considerations go in the face of your health, then you've got to find a way to find those meet in the middle.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of factors in the equation for that. Other behavioral tips around nutrition involve things like shopping on the perimeter of the grocery store. Have you ever noticed in a market or a grocery store, the healthier food is around the perimeter of the grocery store? It's typically where you'll find the produce and the vegetables and those kinds of things, the fruits, and then in the middle of the grocery store would be where you find the chips and the dips and the ice cream and the pizza and those kinds of things. So shopping around the perimeter of the grocery store is a behavioral tip. Shopping specifically with meal planning in mind is another kind of no-brainer one. one. There are a lot of different, of course, approaches to this in terms of what your ethical concerns are around diet and those types of things. Some people, of course, have religious considerations about what they will and won't eat. So you're absolutely right, Poplapo. There are a lot of factors in that equation, and it's whatever feels right to you. Coordinating this with physician care and having lab work done and of course routine medical checkups on at least an annual basis might also shape what our diet looks like and how our nutrition needs to be shaped up to optimize our health generally.
Yeah, that was a good question.
Great question.
We just about hit an hour. If
Yeah,
anyone
any final
has any
thoughts? Do you have any sum up or anything you'd like to
Yeah,
share with us?
when your favorite tool is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And I love sleep disorders medicine. So to me, sleep is really front and center as the pillar of health. Sleep wellness is so critical. There are a lot of different places to go and get help for your sleep, but typically it would involve searching for someone who is a sleep disorders medicine specialist. You would be shocked at how much it will impact your health and wellness to be able to optimize your sleep. So if insufficient quality or insufficient quantity of sleep is a factor for you, it's a great entry point toward moving to the next level with regard to health and wellness. The nutrition and exercise are important as well, but again, I'm biased. I'm a big fan of intervening at the sleep level.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right, well, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Brian, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for coming
on.
My
I hope
pleasure.
we can see you in the metaverse again.
Yes, absolutely. I would love that. And thank you so much, guys. Really good to see you.
All right,
so
we're gonna
let's
take a
get a
picture. I'll go turn off the security.
How do we turn off
That was good.
Oh, okay. All right, we'll get the security turned off and everyone can come up here for a picture. I'm going to turn avatars back on. There we go.
All right, security should be off.
Hello.
You guys can come on the stage.
All right, come on up.
And Ghoster, are you able to use some of the pictures seem kind of dark. I don't know if it was if the light would be or
That's VR chat. VR chat pictures are always dark.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
It's part of that putting a box with light on our face thing. Things that look good in here don't look good on monitor.
Yeah, because the monitor is so bright. And,
Because they don't have the lighting. I guess the lighting isn't the same. Whoa.
Oh,
nice.
that's nice. Yeah, let's try that.
It's like a flash.
Yeah.
Oh, you even have a little icon on the camera.
On the count of three, let's all say
sleep.
Sleep. Get some sleep.
You put us all to sleep. The power of suggestion.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
All right, ready?
Yay. No, where did that other avatar go?
I don't know. They were really cute.
I know.
They were like a little burrito.
Yay, well, thanks everyone for coming.
I have the same avatar as well.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Brian, for coming on the show.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
thanks,
thank you. Yeah. Popo, so
I
nice to meet
also
you.
have the
Thank
same
you.
avatar
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
Absolutely. Good to meet you.
Hope to see you again some other time.
Absolutely, yeah. Would love to. Thank you. I still don't know my way around, but I'll figure it out, I think, as I go.
It was a failed idea that I had about people who had questions could just hold the number.
Thanks for coming on the show. It was really good.
That's it.
Yeah, thanks, man.
It's
Enjoyed
incredible,
it. Thank you.
Incredible.
No one else can take it from you.
You don't have a
Thank
question?
you.
You don't have a
Where
question?
did Indian Alley go?
Oh,
Sure.
Perfectly fine.
Probably around
Give me 5.
That's like halfway through. Yeah, I noticed.
it's incredible knowledge, right?
Yeah, sure.